Hey, thanks for joining us today for this quick webinar to talk about PCI DSS version 4 and what you really need to know. My name is Sean Goodwin, and I'm our lead QSA here at Wolf. With me, I have Rich Rocchio, who's another QSA, and what we're going to do today is start to talk through some of the key points you really need to know in version 4, especially what's changed since version 3.2.1. We're also going to talk through the adoption timeline because not all of these changes are going into effect immediately. And then we're going to highlight some of the key things we think you need to be looking out for to make sure this transition is smooth as possible. So with that, Rich, what's new in V4 that folks really need to be worried about?
Thanks, Sean. So first things first, the goals of the Assessors Council for PCI DSS V4 is to continue to be up to speed with the ever-evolving cyberspace and security environment. In addition to that, the Council wants to move PCI DSS from an annual compliance audit to a continuous compliance process. Their main driver of doing this is to add more flexibility for entities on different methodologies to meet the rigors of PCI DSS. First things first, there are requirements for documentation of roles and responsibility throughout the standard. Few of the critical version 4 requirements are now documentation requirements for the roles and responsibilities of personnel on complying to each of the requirements. Specifically, in requirement 3, there's now enhanced protection on cardholder data and primary account numbers. If personnel are accessing the system remotely, they will not be able to copy data out of the environment. In addition to that, there are now more structured on risk-based controls at the entity. The entity now has more ownership over the frequency of those controls based on risk. There'll be more on that later. There are also increased controls on the web application for payments. Real-time protections must be enabled, as well as integrity testing for any scripts that appear on payment pages. As far as user access controls and reviews, there's also enhanced documentation and review requirements there to ensure that any privilege creep is identified and remediated in a timely fashion. As far as authentication goes, with the new standard, all users accessing the cardholder data environment must enroll in multi-factor authentication. In addition to that, the minimum length of passwords is increasing from 8 to 12. And definitely not the last change, but the last one I'd like to highlight is that all internal vulnerability scans that are run on a quarterly basis must now be authenticated. Here you'll see a snip of a new requirement in the report on compliance. Now, all new PCI templates are on the PCI portal. We'd like to highlight the rocks specifically because there are some major changes we're looking at right here. The first one I'd like to go through is the customized approach. The customized approach allows entities to meet requirements in different methods or through different means than the ones listed out in the defined approach. To do that, they must fill out a control matrix, and we strongly recommend that entities use a templated matrix in Appendix E of the report on compliance. And while an assessor company can assist entities in completing this matrix, if they do so, they cannot be the same assessor company that reviews the effectiveness of these controls. The Council also wanted to put a point of emphasis on the distinction between compensating controls and the customized approach. If an entity chooses to go with the customized approach, they cannot use compensating controls worksheets. The targeted risk analysis allows entities to have more ownership over their risk-based controls, such as the frequency in which they will review a given control. We strongly recommend that companies use the template in Appendix E2 as a best practice. In addition to this, another best practice we recommend is providing these control matrices to the QSA prior to testing so that the QSA is able to determine appropriate testing procedures to ensure implementation and ongoing effectiveness.
All right, great. So there's a few things in there that we've highlighted that certainly are not as easy as flipping a switch, both evaluating using the customized approach for any of these DSS controls, as well as getting the appropriate targeted risk analysis worksheets completed is going to certainly take some time. To give you an idea around the timeline, right now version 4 is live. So as of today, companies can choose to be assessed against version 4. Wolf is a version 4 assessor. So if you're in that position, you've already gone through some of that pre-work and you're ready to be tested against version 4, we can certainly help with that. But it is worth noting that it's not required at this point. You can see on the graphic that red vertical line highlights where we are right now. Version 3.2.1 still has a good amount of life left in it. You don't have to use version 4 until 2024. So that does give you some time in parallel to start evaluating some of the new changes in version 4 while you maintain your version 3.2.1 compliance program. This gives you really the flexibility to start looking at not only getting those targeted risk analysis worksheets completed, but starting to evaluate, do we want to use the customized approach for any controls? One common example that we've been talking to some folks about is around minimum password length. That becomes an issue. That's been an issue for a lot of folks. We see a lot of companies using things like key-based authentication to remote systems. It certainly can be configured to be a very secure means of authenticating a user, but that doesn't necessarily directly line up with these minimum password requirements, complexity requirements, et cetera. That customized approach gives you the opportunity to redefine what you're doing from a control perspective, document that, and make sure that you're meeting the intent of the control. So as you work through the DSS, you'll see not only does the document outline what the expected control is, but it tells you the intent of the control so that you can evaluate which approach is appropriate for you. It's also worth noting during this implementation period where you're evaluating when you'll make the switch over to version 4, you are able to take that customized approach at a control by control level. It's not an all or nothing. So you can have 99% of the controls tested through the defined approach, which is what you're used to up until now. And then maybe you have 1 or 2 controls that you're going to use that customized approach. That flexibility is available for you in version 4. So what do you need to know if you're going to issue a version 4 report right now? The first one, there's 13 requirements that are applicable day 1. So if you're going to test version 4 today, 13 of these new requirements are required to be included in that assessment. The good news here is that's largely the documentation around the roles and responsibilities. Almost every requirement has a new sub-requirement justifying roles and responsibilities for maintaining the control environment for that requirement, 2 through 11, to specific individuals and making sure that they're aware of this. That's not a huge lift and is certainly something you can get implemented if you wanted to pursue a version 4 document at this point. The targeted risk analysis is another one that's going to take a little bit of time, especially where you may have multiple controls using a risk-based approach, various reviews for non-critical alerts, patching windows, et cetera. Those sorts of things. You do need to work through the process of completing that form. As Rich mentioned, we do recommend using the council's provided template, mainly because you are allowed to use your own template for a targeted risk analysis, but there are several very specific requirements that need to be included. And for the sake of accuracy and completeness, we find it is generally easiest to use the provided template. The scoping exercise is also something that you'll want to go through. Now, you should already be doing this on an ongoing basis as part of maintaining a PCI compliant environment year round, but you want to make sure you are meeting the documentation requirements that the council is outlining. And then finally, if you're a service provider, you do want to make sure that you've documented your process for supporting your customers. And what I mean by this is there's a requirement for service providers to formalize their process as far as getting their AOCs and other related compliance documentation to any of their customers that are relying on the service provider for meeting their own compliance needs. So the future dated requirements, there are several where you're going to see this throughout the version 4 document. And this is similar to what we had with the release of version 3.2.1. Many of these controls are going to be included in your assessment, but you're not required to have them in place. If you are working through an assessment and these controls are not yet implemented, your assessor will simply mark them as not applicable because they're not required until 2025. That doesn't mean you can't have them. So if you've already done the work and you've got these controls in place and you want that badge of honor to say we actually comply with everything in here, that's also allowed. So some things to look out for. I tried to highlight a couple of them there. Rich, is there anything else you think folks really need to be made aware of?
Yes, there are a couple major shifts to the ROC itself. One of those is the overall assessment results. The council has now added the option for a partial assessment. And a partial assessment can be used in a variety of ways. I've tried to highlight a couple here, such as a payment brand or an acquirer wanting to validate a small subset of controls at an entity. In addition to that, the entity may want to validate a major PCI change to their environment and only test against the security controls that this change will impact. And lastly, there are service provider organizations that would make more sense to just complete a partial assessment, such as a document shredding company, which would only need to comply to some physical controls, not much else. In addition to that, there is also a new control status, and that is in place with remediation. And the intent of this status is to be used when at any point in testing, an entity is not compliant with a control, but throughout the course of testing, makes the necessary changes to become compliant at the end of the engagement. Now, part of making these necessary changes is being able to show that the control is implemented and will not fail in the future. Examples of this may include a mispatched window, an untimely removal, or an untimely user access review.
Great. So thank you for spending a few minutes with us today to talk through what we're seeing as changes related to version 4. At the bottom of this page, you'll see there's a quick link that'll bring you directly to the council's version 4 resource hub, where everything we've talked about here and more is covered. So certainly check that out and make sure you're aware of the changes that are coming your way. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Rich or myself. We're really excited about the opportunity that version 4 brings in making PCI a living process with organizations, and think there's a lot of good that's going to come out of this for the greater payment security industry. Both our phone numbers and emails are listed there, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.